All right. This lecture is about the ancient origins of DNA and blood chemistry and what that tells us about our spiritual origins and destiny. And it relates to what we were talking about yesterday about the symmetries that create fire in the blood and power in DNA. Now I'm just going to put a screen share on here and put some images about this. So what we're talking about here is an extension of what we discussed yesterday, that the origins of alphabets, which relates to the origin of DNA, are actually a sequence of toroids, a sequence of spirals on a donut that create a sequence of shadows that creates a certain program that creates a certain electric field. And we saw that from the animations of the origin of Hebrew. I don't know if the people there were there yesterday, where we looked at the self-organizing spiral on the donut that created the Hebrew alphabet. And that was also a propulsion device, that the actual spiral of plasma on a torus creates a vector of propulsion in a certain direction. Let me just, here I have the donut here, maybe I'll just share that again. So we were talking about the fact that this spiral on this torus, if you look at the various angles of that spiral on the donut, that you get Hebrew and actually Sanskrit. So these were recording devices to record a sequence of the symmetry of charge domain donut, the tori. And we animated that in terms of Hebrew. And today we're going to look at more ancient languages, the Banpo, the flame letter alphabet, and we're going to look at Ophanim-Enochian, which relates to the work of John Dee and the alchemic tradition. So that animation, just to play just a piece of that for the people who may not have been there yesterday. So this is the spiral on the torus, indexed by the axes of symmetry of the tetrahedron. You see Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and this is He, pi, squares the circle. So this is just to show you that the alphabets were a recording device for a sequence of turns of mind to program charge domains, charge domain donuts, a vortex symmetry theory. So today where we're going to go with this is we're going to look at some of the more ancient alphabets, Ophanim-Enochian, and see if there's a clue to the origins of even blood chemistry, which is the key subject of this lecture, which is the ancient history of DNA as it applies to blood chemistry. So here's the roots of the alphabet of Ophanim-Enochian. You see that it's a vortex within a vortex, a tornado within a tornado on the left. And then if you sequence those letters, those vortexes, a sequence of spirals, you get this hypercube symmetry, which John Dee originated, the mathematician, who then was studied by Vincent Bridges, who prepared this graphic here about the hypercubic origins of Ophanim-Enochian. And these are the letters themselves on the bottom right, and you see that they look like a sequence of vortexes that are assembled in like a sequence of wormholes. And on the left is an example of the sequence of the letters converted into our English alphabet, and you see what those letters are: Zavkiel, Zadkiel, Kunael, Raphael, Haniel, Mikael, and in red there, Gabriel. So these are angel names. So what do angel names have to do with charge domain plasma symmetry? And that really is the heart of our issue, that the great interstellar plasma beings are really, as the plasma universe people teach, is the real spiritual roots of our religious traditions. So that's a big subject and we can only touch on it. But what we want to look at today then is what that tells us about the history of blood and blood chemistry. So first we're going to look at, this is from Stuart Swerdlow. He is mapping the various extraterrestrial influences on the Earth DNA from the perspective of the Montauk survivors, the time travel projects. I happen to know Al Bielek and many of the Montauk people personally, and I had the conversations with them about how this originated. And you see that, I don't know if you can see clearly here, but the groups of the extraterrestrials involved with intervening on Earth were divided into the interventionists versus the non-interventionists. The Syrians, for example, were non-interventionists. The Rigelians were very interventionist. They were basically Draco. And that's another big, long story that we don't have time for. But we can see that in the language history of Earth, that what's called the Ur-Elic origin of language trees, the Ura here, suggests the root of the language tree is Uru, which we see later is a name for a bloodline which was investigated at length by someone called Anton Parks. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Anton Parks had intense Kundalini experiences during which he became immersed in the plasma memories of basically Enki, Osiris, also known as Samuel Nudimud. And this was important to me because I also had intense Kundalini experiences and also wrote a book on the life of Enki, actually. And it's no coincidence that people who are having these intense plasma experiences always get immersed in certain personalities and histories, because these are a turning point in the plasma history of DNA. Now, Enki, Osiris, Samuel, Nudimud looked like, on the top left, you see, he was green, he was sort of half frog. And we know for sure that in Egypt, virtually every depiction of Osiris is shown with a green face. The supposed green man. And we also know that the ancient blood chemistries here, I have a slide about the history of blood chemistry, that the mythology is that the ancient blood was chlorophyll based, and that there was a replacement made in the history of blood, which is we want to talk about here. This is the comparison of the hemoglobin on the left and chlorophyll on the right. The story is that the ancient blood was green and chlorophyll based, and you see that the chemistry required to switch chlorophyll to hemoglobin is replacing the Mg magnesium with Fe iron in the center there. And Enki called us the Adamic race, the red race, because of the role of iron in our blood, which he found fascinating. And that the iron is what makes our blood red. It carries the oxygen. Now, we need to understand the history of blood chemistry in terms of what it implies for how we can transform ourselves into interstellar plasma beings, which is the subject of today's lecture. This is just a little bit of a background of what the Uru, Uras, Draco blood looked like. On the top you have the Sumerian goddess figurine, top left, from the Ubayyad, and on the bottom right you have the morph to the face of Draco as depicted by people like Anna Hayes and later Phil Schneider, who saw the Draco as adults. And also on the top center you see the morph to the ancient dragon queen of the Celtic tradition. And here on the top right you have the comparison with the Draco face with what Enlil and Enki probably looked like. We think that Enlil was basically Yahweh, and Enlil, or Enki, I'm sorry, Enlil was Yahweh, and Enki became called Atum or Tam, and his science partner, Thoth, Hermes, became the ancestor of the Egyptian royal line. The Thothmosis, sons of Thoth, is a name for the royal bloodlines of Egypt. Now this slide is a bit small, but this is you can see I have about 100 articles about extraterrestrial history of blood, and they're all at goldenmean.info/the rest of the story. So you can see these slides in much more detail in this whole conversation. But this is an analysis of this comparison of these two major lines. You had the interstellar plasma beings, Seraphim Ophanim on the top, and that became called EB, bird, and you see the bird depiction of Thoth, for example, on the left, versus on the right you have the Uru, as in EB Uru crossing over Hebrew, Uru, Uras, dragon blood, Draco, Alpha Draconis, then Nephilim, Anunnaki. And we're not going to do this history today, but you can take this schematic of the ancient family of Alpha Draconis, who probably came here per Anton Parks and my own work from Pleiades. Every native tradition on the planet that talks about ET origins pretty much agrees that it was Pleiades they came from, as does Anton Parks. And that family, as shown in this chart, Anu, Enki, and Lil, becomes the names of God in virtually every major tradition on the planet. The Egyptian name, for example, for Enki was Ptah Atun. In Greek, he was called Poseidon. In Babylon, he was called Ea, and Zoroaster. In African, he was called Atum and Kilimanjaro, as Creator Mulak told us personally, is a name for Enki. In Christian, Enki is called Lucifer, Baal, Beelzebub, Norse is Loki, etc., etc. And in Aboriginal, it's fish god versus snake god. So this is a universal tradition for the planet. But this lecture is not about the history. Our friends did that work. Vincent Bridges did that work, and Anton Parks did that work. And if you want to see serious history that transcends Sitchin, I recommend Anton Parks. Here is the book. Most of his books are French, but I have a slide here for his books in English. Here it is. The books from Anton Parks in English, Secret of the Dark Stars is the primary one I would recommend. Pahana books, and also his book Eden is available. But this particular lecture is about the secret of the dark stars, because the secret of the dark stars is that your ancestors, the dragon queen, the winged plasma beings, actually inhabit and steer and form the control mechanisms for the black holes. They are the dark stars. The ancient dark stars is the plasma origins of the beingness of our ancestors, and that is the secret of the dark stars. And I think Anton Parks is right. What I'm here to talk about is the physics of that. I'm not going to deal with trying to prove the history. I leave that to others. I'm interested in the physics. This is an example from Anton Parks where he shows, as in Aboriginal Australia, coming right from Draco, Uru, Anunnaki, the male and the female tribes have a separate language. And in the Draco, it was called Emesa and Emanita. And the fact that the men and the women of the tribe had separate languages is profound, because remember that for myself, this is a table of the bloodlines from Anton Parks, which I suggest you look at in the original. But for myself, I began studying extraterrestrial history of DNA because specifically I realized that the history of Earth, almost every culture on Earth, is a history of fear of women, frankly. And I wanted to know where fear of women came from, and I realized the origin is ET. And when they came from Pleiades, they were actually fleeing a female-dominated culture. And again, I recommend Anton Parks on that. So, you say, is there a modern example of the ancient blood chemistry? And I say yes. The ancient Uru Draco had a blood chemistry, which I propose to discuss now. And a current example is this Iradia couple from Russia. And their body needs radioactivity to have peak perception. They are intolerant to oxygen, and they're an indicator of the kind of blood chemistry I'm about to discuss. So, if we see, what we want to understand here is, and maybe I'm going to bring my face back here for just a moment, turning off the... What we want to understand here is the role of our ability to transform our blood and plasma into an interstellar being. We know the advanced spiritual beings. Bentov, my teacher who wrote the book on the biomechanics of Kundalini, he was able to inhabit and steer the whole Earth as a plasma body, and the advanced beings we know go through the center of the sun as a plasma body. So essentially, to become plasma projected is to evolve, which is the definition of the term Shem-An. And to get there, we need to know what implodes and makes our plasma, our aura, our ka, our boat into the underworld, what makes it projectable. And that has to do with our blood chemistry, and the history of our blood chemistry is a clue. And the difference between our blood chemistry and our Draco ancestors is essential to understanding what we have to offer, because our civilization is primitive compared to theirs, so our technology is child's play to them, but our blood chemistry is powerful. And if we understand that, then we understand our leverage among the ETs. So if you look at all the history, and I'm referring to a paper here now by a partner of ours named Bill Donovan, who wrote a paper on the chemistry of extraterrestrial blood. He is an advanced chemist. And basically his conclusion from studying the literature is that the ancient Draco Uru Anunnaki, who obviously aged catastrophically when they arrived here, had problems. And the problems they had were their blood chemistry. And he concluded that their blood is a lipid oil-based from their ancestral home, probably in a star somewhere in Alpha Draconis before they were in Pleiades, and that they breathed in nitrogen and breathed out cyanogen, the flame of the dragon blood. And we know from the dissections of the Draco kind of stool pigeons, the greys, at Area 51 and elsewhere, that they had carbon, bone, and silicon nerve. So we're talking about nitrogen breathing, cyanogen exhaling. They were relatively poisoned by high oxygen, and they would have trouble with moisture. So they like a dry climate, they like low oxygen, and they're terraforming our Earth to be what they need, which is high radioactive, low oxygen. So you remember the Orion Wars, the wars they came from are called the Oxygen Wars. And they're called that because the terraforming is a contest between those who want to breathe oxygen versus those who want to breathe nitrogen. And there's a kind of a story about that in France called the Plague of Azoth, which means the plague of nitrogen, but it also related to the radioactive poisoning from the Ark of the Covenant, which is what really Plague of Azoth is in the ancient French painting. But radioactivity is a very powerful trigger for certain kinds of blood chemistry, including theirs. And if you study the Paul Brown nuclear battery, you understand the physics. The gamma ray emissions serve a trigger for electron transport, and it's basically their Bliss process. But in the process, in their home star, probably Thuban, Theuba in Alpha Draconis, they had the radioactive environment, and so their DNA was much more susceptible to mutation. So this gives us all kinds of clues to the religious history of the planet, because from the Draco Uru Anunnaki perspective, DNA that changes is defective. And that's the origin of the caste system in India and the Aboriginal marriage law. And it's called the Monsanto mistake. You can read my website about the perils of Monsanto, goldenmean.info/food. But the Monsanto mistake is not to recognize that the actual intelligence of DNA requires genetic diversity, because that is fractality and what makes it conjugate and implosive and self-organizing. So obviously, if you don't believe in genetic diversity, you got a problem called the Monsanto mistake. Well, the Monsanto mistake is the Draco mistake, because when they were relying on radioactivity, as the irradiate couple in Russia does today, for electron transport and peak perception, that meant that they had more mutations. And so they had to fight to keep the mutations out of the DNA. And that's why the Draco, also called the Mormons, recorded their genetics and burnt charge domains on copper foil, which was what Joseph Smith was studying. With Urim and Thummim were a tetrahedral index to the charge domain. It's a long story. The point being that now we can understand a difference between our potential to steer the stars and theirs. And this is the story to the Mori, the happily ever after of our conversation. Because if you study the extraterrestrial history, you realize that we humans are weak politically, we're weak technologically, we have very little to offer in terms of the interstellar commerce because we're so primitive. They were Sitchin was right. They were here to mine the gold because they were eating it, the monoatomics, the spice. But currently we know now that they can fabricate their monoatomics using the plasma, as we understand now that Keshe is doing, and we're doing that with them. So we don't have what they need in terms of technology, no. But what we do have, and our leverage in the extraterrestrial sort of story here, is the power of our emotions to fabricate a plasma field called the aura, the Ka, the boat to the underworld, and therefore project plasma in a way that they can't. Basically, we are potentially far more psychokinetic than they are. And I'm trying to explain that gently to the humans here, because that gives us our leverage, our ticket at the poker game. And our leverage to steer plasma aura charge more psychokinetically than they can depends on understanding the blood chemistry, which is what this lesson is about. The famous story, and I knew who told this story personally, Alex Collier with the Andromedans group. The story was, they were watching this police officer in Chicago, and in 1 second he shoots an escaping criminal, and about 2 seconds later he runs over and very emotionally tries to save the life of the person he just shot. So he switched from anger to compassion on a dime, very quickly. And this is profound because the skill to switch emotions rapidly is, from a genetic perspective, as valuable as having a transistor that switches fast for computer design. The rapidity of our ability to switch coherent emotions is our leverage on the stars. Now, I want to try to introduce a little bit about how it is that emotion creates implosion and the ability to be plasma projective, Shem-onic, which means, Shem means, remember yesterday we talked about access to the black hole on Sun God. So our ability to have emotions that throw our aura around, to be psychokinetic, to grow up and steer stars, depend in part on us understanding the physics well enough to do it well. So what is the history of the power of coherent emotion? And remember, I am probably the person on this planet most famous for the term coherent emotion. I spent my life on this question. And basically, it's simple. Here's a graphic. I'm going to turn the graphics on again for a moment. What we have pioneered is measuring the effect of heart coherence on DNA braid. And I just want to show you a little bit about that. And this is all at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. But this is the chart. This is from Glenn Ryan's study he did at my suggestion, where on the left you see the onset of coherent heart, love as it were, and on the right you see the measurement of a dramatic increase in the presence of the enzyme that is the amount of braid in DNA. In other words, simply, when you feel bliss and love, your DNA braids recursively, implodes, aligns the active sites, becomes a conjugator and a black hole maker. Now, I went a little fast there. I'll show you a few more slides about that in terms of how DNA is doing this. If we look in the geometry of DNA, let me see if I can find the right slides here. Give me just a moment. Yeah, this is what I'm looking for. DNA is a dodecahedron, which is a four-dimensional cube, makes 4 axes of spin switch, and it's ratcheted down a helix. You ratchet the dodeca down a helix, you have 5 axes of spin. And then you braid that thread into string, into rope, into fat rope 7 times. So you have 7, before the DNA gets very thick in recursive embedded braiding, and you have 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, etc. That was yesterday's conversation. So what happens when the DNA recursively braids is it embeds a long wave on a short wave, and that physics, oh, I need to find another slide here, wait. Oh yeah, here's the original slide. So basically the plot thickens. The DNA gets much thicker. You see on the far right, you have the thread there in yellow, and the thread is braided, and it's braid of the braid, and braid of the braid. It gets very thick. And when that braiding is phase coherent, called coherent in motion, in fact golden ratio conjugate, then the ratio of the long wave to the short wave embedding makes the piezo physics of DNA potentially conjugate implosive. We call that getting a soul. And it's literally a black hole in DNA. It's when you begin to make gravity and have all kinds of fun psychokinesis. So our power, and again I have to do this very briefly, we only have a few minutes here. I'm going to turn that screen off now. Back to my face. So our power on our DNA is our ability to have coherent emotion, because when you do, your hair stands up, you become implosive, you get leverage on your aura, and you can throw your weight around astrally, etherically. Your aura is projectable. Now, let us compare that to what we've just learned about our nitrogen-breathing, cyanogen-exhaling, lipid blood ancestors, Enlil Yahweh, who says, you are the chosen race, and oh, by the way, don't let any water be in my meat, because water is a poison to me. It is, but you should also know that oxygen is a poison to those Dracos. So if you want to get the Draco Uru shapeshifters out of the U.S. Senate, simply pump in some oxygen. Very simple. And this is a history of terraforming. Now, because they're trying to create a high radioactive environment, low oxygen, and no moisture, the desert, the dune story, and we need the opposite. And this is the sort of called, this story is called Total Recall, Mars, you know. So, in addition to knowing their ancestral weaknesses, they were aging catastrophically on arrival here because of the oxygen and the moisture, which was antithetical to them. And this is very clear in the Sumerian. And they had to fabricate, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord. Shemin meaning altar and church. Later we realized High-word firestone, Sitchin's translation, which we now know means bioactive field generator. That's what a Shem is, which is a phase conjugate dielectric. It's an implosive capacitor, which time reverse eliminates aging. It's rejuvenation field. It's our Prior device, etc., etc. So you had access to the life force giving field if you had the right politics. The ultimate life force giving field was, in Sumerian, it's called Dharana in Anton Park's translation of the word. Our word for that would be roughly Stargate. It's what Uru Asa El Jerusalem was for. Uru, dragon blood, Asa, queen of El, the place of the phase shift, the place of the vortex translation. So Stargate Temple was worth having a war over if, in fact, the plasma projector was working. However, Uru Asalem, Jerusalem's plasma projective Stargate is broken, so it ain't worth having a war over. Suggest instead we do the physics to learn how to build it. Now, Akhenaten, who was assigned by the Syrians to make another plasma projector called Amarna, screwed up the checkbook, ran for his life, changed his name to Moses, and stole the ark, and made the gold powder, and that was the cash cow. And that's, even Lawrence Gardner agrees on that story. And the Ark of the Covenant was also the mana machine. It was the gold powder maker, which was the major cash cow of the Essenes. And this was all their immortality technology gone awry. And if we understood the physics, we wouldn't have to fight over it. And that's why we're teaching the physics today. So to finish this story, and I'm going to wind this up. To finish this story, we also know that their bones had a high percentage of carbon. You can look at the dissections at Roswell, etc. And their nerves had a high percentage of silica. And we know the silica nerve has a higher phase propagation velocity. This means that their brainwave spectrum analysis was much higher frequency. They're gamma and higher, which meant that they had very high telepathy, the Tibetan gamma story, 44 hertz and above in the brainwave, rare in most humans. Very high frequency brainwaves enabled projective telepathy, which also enabled them to some extent for mind control, embedding, all kinds of cool stuff. And you can read about Phil Schneider's encounter with the Dracos adults if you don't believe the mind control and telepathy. It's real. The problem was that with the high phase propagation velocity of the silicon nerve structure, the Greys, the Dracos, they did not have low frequencies in their brain waves. And I am the one who proved that the frequency signature of the EEG during Bliss is a low frequency golden ratio, and hopefully we've actually prepared the slide here. This is where you actually have to play the slide. Okay, this is, if you don't believe me, I'm going to display now a measurement which I pioneered this work with my